Allow me to introduce you to Belle Gibson, a young Australian woman who, against all odds, survived a terminal diagnosis twice and decided to use her experiences to help rid the world of cancer and make it a healthier place, one pantry at a time. Now, what if I told you that that was all a lie? The year was 2009, the beginning of the end of Belle's life as she knew it. She was 18 years old, a brand new mother, and the sole caretaker of her mother, who was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis and an autistic brother. And, like most teenagers, an avid user of the internet. It was on a skateboarding forum that Belle received her first taste of her drugs of choice: attention and sympathy. She had made a post, which she claimed was made from a hospital, in which she shared in extreme detail her harrowing heart surgery, which at one point saw her die on the operating table before she was resuscitated. But soon after this near-death, or I suppose actual death experience, came the news that would change the course of Belle's life forever, but not in the way that you'd imagine. After experiencing a stroke at work, which she would later attribute to a vaccine, I believe it was the HPV vaccine in particular, Belle went to the doctor. And I want you to hold on to this fact because it will become very relevant later. And so she gets a few tests done, only to be called back to the doctor's office, and I'm emphasizing the doctor's office for a reason, where she was given the devastating news that she, at only 18 years of age, had a stage 4 brain tumor and only 4 months to live. She would later share this exact same version of events in the introduction to her best-selling book, The Whole Pantry. Fast forward to early 2013. Belle, now 21 years old, and despite the terrible prognosis that she'd received 4 years prior, was still very much alive and well. By then, Instagram was still in its infancy, and Belle had taken to it to share her story of how she had decided to pull herself out of traditional cancer therapy and had instead managed to cure herself through alternative therapies such as Gerson therapy and food. The response was everything she had hoped for and more. Soon, she was gracing the covers of magazines and appearing on numerous talk shows as everyone wanted a piece of the young and beautiful woman who had managed to beat, or more accurately, live with, a terminal stage 4 diagnosis of brain cancer.
For a person living with brain cancer, you look incredibly healthy.
And despite noticing her healthy glow, no one seemed to question her story. Eventually, Belle caught Apple's eye, and soon they had her flying out to Silicon Valley to help work on a secret project at the time, which would later be revealed to be the Apple Watch. But the Apple Watch wasn't the only project. By August of 2013, Apple and Belle had released the Whole Pantry app, one of the first apps of its kind, which Belle described as an entry point for people wanting to start a more wholesome way of life. Needless to say, the app was a groundbreaking success, and everything was seemingly going according to plan for Belle. That is, until July of 2014, when she made the following post on Instagram. It hurts me to find space tonight to let you all know, with love and strength, that I've been diagnosed with a 3rd and 4th cancer. I have cancer in my blood, spleen, brain, uterus, and liver. I am hurting. As you would expect, the outpouring of sympathy and well wishes from her hundreds of thousands of followers at this point was quite significant. And surprisingly, despite this horrible diagnosis, Belle remained in the public eye, looking as healthy as ever. And this was to be the case almost a year later, in February of 2015, at the launch of her wellness book, The Whole Pantry. But little did Belle know at the time that the launch of this book would prove to be her undoing. Meet Richard Gilliatt, a journalist and author who had been writing about the wellness industry since 2012. And during his research, he took a keen interest in young influencers such as Jessica Ainscough, another young Australian woman who was publicly battling cancer, and of course, Belle Gibson. Like Belle, Jessica chose alternative methods to deal with her cancer, which was a rare form of cancer called epithelioid sarcoma. And like Belle, she chose to make that fight public. However, unlike Belle, cancer ended up winning the 7-year battle that Jessica so bravely and publicly waged, and she ultimately succumbed to the disease in 2015 when she was 30 years old. Now, from Richard's perspective, as someone who researched wellness and who'd interviewed numerous cancer specialists, he couldn't help but have a nagging feeling about the authenticity of Belle's story. Richard decides to follow his instincts and goes to Belle's book launch in February of 2015, and one factor immediately caught his eye.
The thing that you first notice about Belle Gibson is that she just doesn't look sick at all, like she's a picture of glowing health.
He ended up getting an interview out of her at that meeting, which led to perhaps the most damning revelation of all. Belle had confided in Richard that even she wasn't sure if her cancer diagnosis was real. This bizarre admission seemed to confirm Richard's suspicions about the girl, and so he set about trying to expose her for the fraud that she was. But around the same time, coincidentally, other journalists were starting to pick up on the fishy stench reeking from the whole pantry. You see what I did there? And during the process of their investigations, they uncovered something which would be the catalyst for the destruction of Belle's entire scheme. It turns out, Belle had made a charitable pledge, a pretty big one, $300,000 to be exact. And she failed to donate a single cent until journalists started calling her out on it, and she finally donated 1,000, only 1,000 of that $300,000 pledge. With this allegation going viral on social media, Richard knew that now was the time to strike and to publish his findings on the 23 or 26-year-old. It depends, what day of the week it is, because even her age turned out to be a lie.
How old are you?
I've always been raised as being currently a 26-year-old.
How old are you?
Well, I live knowing, as I've always known, that I would be 26.
This is a really, really simple question. How old are you?
I believe that I'm 26.
And
I have two birth certificates.
Currently, then, according to those documents, you're 23.
Correct.
And if you think that's the worst of it, hang on tight. We're only just getting started. The story of how she got diagnosed changed. If you remember from earlier in the video, I asked you to hang on to the fact that in the introduction to her book, she claimed that she went to a doctor's office and was tested and diagnosed eventually with stage 4 brain cancer. Now, like me, I'm sure the image that you conjure when you hear that or when you read that is her being in a traditional setting with a qualified doctor who ran traditional tests like blood tests and scans. Well, much like everything else in Belle's story, that wasn't exactly the truth. In the updated version of the story, Belle claims that a man called Mark Johns, an immunologist and neurologist who practices in alternative or integrative medicine, as Belle dubbed it, came to her house where he ran some sort of frequency test on her body, which measured her frequencies, and somehow arrived at the conclusion that she had stage 4 brain cancer. So there was no doctor. There was no doctor's office. Heck, there wasn't even a Mark Johns, because it turns out he too was another creation of Belle's. Now, when she was questioned why she lied to hundreds of thousands of people in her book, she stated,
Because I think that being open and telling people the way that it happened would not be understood.
So she lied to cover up a lie. This is like lieception here. According to Belle, in 2010, she started doubting that she even had a stage 4 brain tumor because she was still very much alive and well. And so she claims that she went to a hospital, ordered an MRI scan, which was received by Mark Johns, who doesn't exist, who confirmed to her that she did indeed have brain cancer. There's no proof of her visiting the hospital in 2010, but there is proof that she visited it in 2011, where she had an MRI scan because she was worried that, like her mother, she had multiple sclerosis. Now, this meeting actually took place. There are documents that prove this consultation. And during this 40-minute consultation, she was given the all clear for not only MS, but anything wrong with her brain for that matter, including having a tumor in it. Now, this was in 2011, which would mean that by the time she made her first post sharing how she had cured her brain cancer in 2013, she already knew definitively that she didn't have brain cancer or any form of cancer for that matter. But aside from all the lies to profit off of people's kindness and sympathy, perhaps the most egregious crime that Belle committed was conning an entire population of cancer sufferers and leading them to believe that they too could cure their cancer, their very real cancer, through unproven alternative remedies touted by an unqualified woman, thereby giving them false hope at best and at worst potentially leading to their own demise because they didn't take the appropriate care and the appropriate steps that they otherwise would have, but for Belle's deception. And does Belle show any remorse for this? Of course not.
But I was not an expert in anyone else's health.
And because these people never cease to amaze us with how far they would go and how depraved they are, Belle went as far as befriending the family of a young boy who was actually suffering from a brain tumor. And according to his family, she would press them for his symptoms so that she could take them on as her own. Of course, Belle denies this, thereby implying that this family and not her are the liars. But thanks to the hard work of investigative journalists, it was Belle who was proven to be a liar, article after article, in a manner very reminiscent of another fallen fraudster, Elizabeth Holmes, who incidentally also enjoyed the height of her success at the same time as Belle, before her eventual exposure in 2015, much like Belle, when the sordid details of her elaborate scheme unraveled for the entire world to witness. With seemingly nowhere to hide, Belle did what any other fraudster in her shoes would do and decided to give interviews, much like Elizabeth Holmes, where she continued to try to pull the wool over the world's eyes and convince us that she was still the victim. She chose to spin this story. I didn't have cancer, but I thought I did. And that's because I was misdiagnosed by a bunch of quack fake doctors. Not exactly the expected mea culpa, is it? Oh, and by the way, it wasn't just the fact that she was never sick that was exposed. Everything about her story, including her backstory, her origin story as it were, was a lie. Yes, her mother does have multiple sclerosis, but her brother isn't autistic, and she was never the sole or primary caretaker of either of them. In fact, her mother shared that Belle hadn't done a minute's housework in her entire life. Now, with everyone coming out of the woodworks and exposing her, including friends and colleagues, Belle got into severe damage control mode and tried to scrub the internet of any evidence of her battle with cancer. But as we all know, because we're not delusional like Belle, while nothing lasts forever, whatever you post on the internet does. May 2016. Consumer Affairs in the state of Victoria, where Belle resided, launched an investigation into her and her business. Apple quietly removes the whole Pantry app from its App Store and its Apple Watch release, and Penguin Publishing was ordered to pay a $30,000 fine for failing to fact-check any of Belle's fantastical claims. I mean, it wasn't just Penguin Random House, let's face it. No one at the time, much like Elizabeth Holmes, ever thought of questioning her claims. All they saw was this beautiful young woman in front of them, and they were just so ready to lap it all up. It's a theme that's playing out here. In September of 2017, Belle was tried in court and was found guilty of misleading and deceptive conduct. Her punishment? A $410,000 fine, but no jail time. And what do you think? Did she A, end up paying the fine, or B, instead go overseas on multiple luxurious holidays and skipping numerous court dates? If you answered B, then you are correct. Belle did indeed choose the latter option, and she didn't pay a single cent of the fine. And get this, when she did eventually turn up at court in 2019, fresh off a plane from one of her expensive holidays, she claimed that she couldn't pay the fine because she was on Centrelink benefits, which is the social welfare scheme here in Australia, and she was also relying on child support payments for her son. I mean, honestly, as a lawyer who has witnessed people getting punished and charged with contempt of court for doing a lot less, she's really gotten off easy. By January of 2020, almost 3 years since she was found guilty, her fine remained unpaid, which did prompt some sort of retribution in the form of 2 police raids, one in 2020, where they went to her property and seized everything they could to recoup the amount to pay off the fine, and once again in May 2021, when she still failed to pay off the outstanding balance. Now you might be wondering, what's Belle up to now? Well, she pulled an Elizabeth Holmes, of course. Actually, I don't know who did it first, because Elizabeth very recently, if you've seen my video or if you've heard from other sources, tried to reinvent herself as this soft-spoken, quiet mother who just wants to go to the zoo and the beach with her kids, only to have that backfire in her face because no one bought it, and she's actually currently in prison right now, serving out her 11-year sentence. Now, the last I've heard of Belle was that in 2021, she had apparently converted to Islam, had become a teacher, and had started to identify as an Ethiopian.
This was a gift that was a blessing that was given to me, both by your people, but also a blessing from our Lord, from Rabbi, from Allah. My involvement in the Oromo community has been for the last 4 years, and it started through volunteering.
And it looked like Belle still enjoyed a very healthy appetite for scamming. Because according to this ethnic group, not only was Belle never a volunteer, you have to be a registered volunteer, by the way, and she never was, but she started talking about raising a large amount of money as part of a fundraiser for the community. At that point, red flags, alarm bells started going off everywhere, and the president of the Oromo community publicly came out and rejected Belle and told her basically to leave them alone. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the twisted tale of Belle Gibson. It's so interesting having studied so many of these con artists and realizing just how many parallels they have, how many traits they have in common. The lack of ownership, the lack of empathy, the lack of responsibility. Nothing is ever their fault. To them, they truly are the heroes and the victims at the same time. In Belle's case, she jeopardized the lives of thousands, hundreds of thousands potentially, of cancer sufferers around the world with her hoax. But it's evident in her responses to the backlash that despite everything she has done, she still believes that she is the victim in this story. So what's wrong with her? Is this a terrible case of Munchausen syndrome? Because Belle doesn't seem to think so.
I don't accept that because I don't feel that I do.
Or is she, like others of her ilk, leeching off of people's kindness and sympathy and generosity for their own financial or personal gain? It's clear based on the testimony of her family that Belle's always been this way. And based on her most recent actions with the Ethiopian community, she clearly hasn't learned her lesson. If you ask me, I believe that the justice system has just been way too soft on her. I mean, she preyed on society's most vulnerable demographic, the sick, the dying. In a way, she's on par with Elizabeth Holmes. And yet one of them is currently serving out a prison sentence, and the other is free to walk the streets of Melbourne or wherever the heck she lives right now, where she has all the time in the world and all the opportunities to concoct yet another plan, another scheme to defraud people and profit off of her lies. So whether she's severely mentally ill and she needs help, or whether she's a psychopath who will never get better, because research indicates psychopaths never do, I suppose we'll never know, honestly, unless she submits to some sort of mental assessment and the results are shared, because I just don't see her submitting to anything, really. I mean, this is someone who flouts the law for a living. Let me put it that way.